Hey, Kaleea, come on up. Kaleea is one of our leads. Yeah, come on, give it up for Kaleea. Kaleea is one of our leads. She's been serving faithfully since launch. Her and her husband's back there in the hoodie, making everything work. Come on, honey, holding it down. And you have a calling on your life. I've seen her, and I've seen her gift. Some of you guys have seen her gift of speaking, of preaching. And today, she's going to be bringing the word. So y'all get ready. I've heard this message. It's fire. So get ready. Get ready.
Thank you so much. Can we give it up for our senior pastor? He's amazing, always caring and shepherding for our church and our community. So, yeah, thank you so much, Caleb. Okay, guys, let me make sure my stand is up if it wants to work today. You know what? It doesn't, so that's okay. All right, when I was in the 6th grade, I went to a school that required me to wear uniforms. And if your mom is anything like mine, when you get home, really from school or anywhere, you have to change your clothes because your clothes smell like outside, and you smell like outside in your clothes. So on this day, I'm being, the perfect, obedient 12-year-old that I was. No one is home yet. My mom's running a few errands, and she'd be home shortly. So I go in my room, and I'm changing out of my uniform. And I had this fluffy pink carpet in my bedroom that things tend to get stuck in, whether a piece of paper or wire or string, whatever. Well, on this day, there was a mechanical pencil stuck in my carpet. Yeah. And not only was the mechanical pencil stuck in my carpet, but it was sticking straight up. And so the awkward dance you're doing when you're changing out of your pants and you put your foot back on the ground? Yeah, I put my foot back on the ground, full force, full gravity, directly onto this pencil. And not only did this pencil scratch me, it didn't just puncture me, it actually lodged directly into my foot, about 1.5 inches. Yeah, and it didn't come out. It was stuck in there. And so I'm freaking out. As such, no one's home. I crawled to my mom's bedroom. I didn't have a cell phone at this point. We still had house phones. I crawl to her room. I find the house phone, and I'm hysterical. I'm like, Mom, I stepped on a pencil. And I don't think she really fathoms what I'm saying because I am so hysterical. And she's like, Kaleea, I'm sure, it's just a scratch. You'll be okay. I will be home shortly. She gets home about 5 to 10 minutes later. My sister, my mom, and her husband all walk in to me with my foot in the air and a pencil sticking directly out of it. She tries to assess the damage. She touches it. I scream. Realizes that's not going to work, so she calls in the reinforcements. She calls the ambulance. They pick me up. They load me onto this gurney, and what would ensue is about 4 hours of me in the emergency room, sitting in the hallway with a pencil sticking out of my foot, and people walking past asking what the heck happened to her. And so they do these x-rays on my foot to make sure, it didn't hit a main artery and they could just rip it out. And so eventually that's what they do. The doctor, he looks at my foot and he says, we're going to pull it out on 3. There's no other way to get it out. So he pulls it out of my foot, and I'm left with this hole at the bottom of my foot. And as you can imagine, you can't walk if you have a hole at the bottom of your foot. And so she wraps my foot up. And the first time I'm on crutches isn't because I broke my foot or I broke a toe or I broke my arm. It's because I stepped on a pencil. And so I go to school, and for the next month and a half, people are asking me, Kaleea, why are you on crutches? Oh, I stepped on a pencil. It lodged into my foot. But what I'm thankful for is that those crutches not only helped to stabilize me, they helped me to recover. And that's how our relationship with Jesus is. Jesus is a crutch that helps us to stabilize and recover. How many of us know that we have crutches that aren't actually dependable? How many of us know that we tend to lean on crutches when the crutches need us more than we actually need them? And so today, I'm going to be talking about trust falling onto God, using Him as your crutch. Proverbs 3:6 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your path straight. To lean implies that you are putting weight onto something. And you may have heard it said that religion is a crutch. I know I have. Oh, those Christians, they just lean on Jesus because they need something to rely on. Well, yeah, we do. We do need something to rely on, but the truth of the matter is everybody needs something to rely on. And so whether your crutch is relationships, whether your crutch is substances, whether your crutch is music, whether your crutch is experiences or money or finances or travel, we all have a crutch. It's not whether or not we have a crutch, it's if our crutch is dependable. And we're afraid to be identified with our crutches because we've forgotten that everyone has one. But let me tell you, my crutch isn't a rinky-dinky crutch. My crutch isn't made out of rotted wood. My crutch was stable and it was metal. And I'm thankful that God is the same to me. So today we're going to examine the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Pastor Caleb talked about the drought and the rain a little bit last weekend, and so we're going to continue, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what happened before. You see, Elijah was a prophet of God who'd been called to convict the northern kingdom of Israel because there was idol worship, and particularly of Baal. And he had had run-ins with King Ahab and Jezebel, and he was not in good standing with them. But God had called him to convict the people and to actually confront King Ahab and the prophets of Baal. And so what he does is he challenges them to this duel. He says, if your God is real, if your idols are real, if Baal is real, then on Mount Carmel, he is going to consume an animal sacrifice. And if not, my God will consume the sacrifice with fire from the sky. So go with me to 1 Kings 18:27 through 29. It says, at noon, Elijah began to taunt them. Shout louder, he said. Surely he is a god. Perhaps he's in deep thought or busy or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened. I love Elijah here. He's like, where is he? Why isn't he here yet? Show up, show out. So they shouted louder and louder, and they even slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. See how many of us actually use crutches that depend on us more than they depend on us, that we actually have to make sacrifices to these things when it should be the other way around. You see, midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying. Where are you? Show up! And they prophesied until evening sacrifice, but there was no response. No one answered, and no one paid attention. Today, I want to share with you 3 reasons to trust fall with God. Here's point number 1. Trusting God brings heaven to earth. When we put our weight onto what God has called us to do, we trust fall into his purpose, not only for us, but for his greater world. You see, Elijah was bold in his delivery, and he trusted the mission God had given him. This was a risk, guys. He lived in a predominantly pagan culture. He had already had run-ins with Ahab and Jezebel for hiding other prophets and living a life that still served the God of Israel. He had every reason to not challenge these people, and yet he did. You see, to lean on something to some extent always feels like a risk, because our hope isn't in what we see, it's actually in what we don't see. God is always looking for opportunities to do the unexplainable, to show up and show out. This is why Paul says, I will boast in my weaknesses all the more because your strength is made perfect in me. Your strength is made whole in me. Elijah says, I'm going to present myself to King Ahab. I'm going to cross the line. That's risk number 1. Then he says, I'm going to confront the prophets of Baal. That's risk number 2. I mean, these people could kill me. And then he says, I'm going to challenge them to a duel. That's risk number 3. See, Pastor's been talking about this with cutting the rope. Sometimes it takes taking a risk and taking a leap of faith to see God move heaven onto earth. You see, if we truly want to live in a world, not just a church, right? Because we're not just a church. The church is everywhere we go, that encounters the presence of God. It also means confronting our fears and taking risk. This makes room for God to do the miraculous. We can't say we want heaven on earth while constantly being our own source of dependability. We can't say, God, move in my city while being too afraid to say hi to someone in a coffee shop. Sometimes our own pride is our crutch, and that's a debilitating crutch if you ask me, that it would keep you from doing what God has called you to do. Maybe you find your crutches in other things, experiences, relationships, finances. I know for me, it's being consumed by media. That's kind of my measure of escape. Let me get on my phone and scroll for a few hours. But I found that that doesn't cut it. I found that that doesn't fill me up. Listen, again, it's not about your crutch. It's about the dependability of that thing. And when I trust fall into the one who orchestrated the heavens and the stars, he's bound to show up in ways that I couldn't. And we should want him to. I think about near-death experiences. I think about miraculous healings. I think about beating statistics. I mean, we just had the Super Bowl. That's full of underdogs. The NFL is full of underdogs. You see, I don't know about you, but I've got a story that says I shouldn't even be here right now. And it's that God brought heaven to earth in my own life, and he wants to bring it to yours, and he wants to bring it in our world. You see, when Elijah puts his weight on the thing God called him to do, he gets to be a part of heaven on earth. And it's not even about whether or not God is doing it, because I think sometimes we get into this mindset where we're like, oh, God needs us to move heaven onto earth. No, he's inviting you to be a part of it, because he's going to move regardless. And so you can get out of your own way and see it and join him in that partnership, or you could not be a part of it. He's inviting us. He doesn't need us. Go to 1 Kings 18, 36 through 39. It says, at the time of the sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed. He said, Lord, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and Israel, because he knows God has shown up for Abraham, Isaac, and Israel at this point, right? Let it be known today that you are the God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord. Now Elijah's saying to God, show up, God. I need you to show up, and I need you to show out, because I can't do it in my own strength. So these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. I love this part. He says that you are turning their hearts back again, because it's not about him in this display of power or even authority. It's that, God, I want you to show up so that people can know you. Not so that I can look cool and so that I can look powerful, but no, God, I want people to see you. I want revival. I want people to be reconciled to you again. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice and the wood, the stones and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. Amen. This is point number 2. Trusting God is better than trusting myself. You see, on a scoreboard, God will outnumber us every time. When Elijah took the risk to confront these people and trust fell into God's purposes, not only did God show up, but he multiplied. And you know who didn't show up? The idols didn't show up. Those crutches that people were leaning on, they didn't show up. How embarrassing to cry out and to hurt yourself for something that doesn't show up for you. But God, he didn't only show up in fire, he also brought a heavy rain to a drought-filled land. California, hello? Maybe we'll start to look at those storms a little differently. You see, not only does God do, but he multiplies what we can't do in our own strength. Hey, here's the story of when someone thought they knew better than God and took matters into their own hands rather than allowing God to move heaven on earth in their own lives. It's the story of Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, Isaac, and Ishmael. I mean, it sounds complicated just saying it like that. You see, in a crux, God had promised Abraham a nation as numerous as the grains of sand and the stars in the sky. But there was one problem. Abraham and his wife were old, and she was barren. Sarah was barren. And so instead of trusting God, they decided to act. And her way of acting was to send Abraham to their maidservant, Hagar. She says, hey, why don't you go lay with Hagar? You guys will have a baby. We'll raise it as our own, and it'll be perfect. But the issue is that God was still faithful, so Sarah still got pregnant with the child of the promise. You see, when they had Isaac, it created friction in these relationships. And I just want to acknowledge complicated relationships. I know that me growing up, I didn't have the most perfect family unit, and I want to encourage you that God is still faithful even when things get sticky and hairy and confusing. You see, Sarah decides that it would be better for Hagar to go away into the desert because she doesn't want to deal with the fact that Abraham has a baby mama and another child. She says, go into the desert and, God will take care of you. I don't even think she said that. She just wasn't even concerned about that. and so Abraham sends them out, and Hagar is in the desert crying out for her son because they have been abandoned. And she doesn't know how she's going to care for him. And they need water, and they're thirsty. And even in this, God is faithful, and he makes water come out of a rock to cover her. You see, Ishmael isn't typically regarded as the firstborn of Abraham. His story kind of gets glossed over. But I want to say that God recognizes people and honors them even when we don't. And not only did he make water come out of a rock to preserve his life, he made a nation still come out of Ishmael. And in a few chapters, we're going to see that Abraham is actually tasked with the challenge of sacrificing the son of the promise, Isaac. And so I want to say that God is orchestrating justice, even in our frustration, and he is showing up. I tell this story because we live in a time when we trust ourselves. We trust our media, we trust our relationships, we trust our finances, we trust our decision making long before we even think to ask God about it. We trust our relationships. You see, what God intended for Abraham as a father was a whole and healthy family. But by taking matters into their own hands, we see very clearly and practically the complications that brought. Even still, God was faithful. You see, trust isn't submitting to God because we think he's some totalitarian being. No, it's required because his ways are actually higher than our ways. And his thoughts are actually higher than our thoughts. And his love and knowledge and power far outstretches our own. You see, we trust God while letting go of the idol of our own pride, our own thoughts, our own ways of doing things. Because pride is a debilitating crutch. And this brings me to point number 3. Trusting God is a must. It's not a maybe. We complicate things in our own right. Go with me to Genesis 22, 10 through 13. It says, then he reached out his hand and took a knife to slay his son. We're talking about Abraham and Isaac at this point. God has asked him to sacrifice his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. You see, Abraham has a redemptive moment here. He trust falls into God despite the risk of losing his son, the son he's been praying for. When we say yes instead of maybe to God, we get to practice letting go of the things that hold power in our lives. Maybe it's taking a break from relationships because you're hopping from one to one. Maybe it's taking a break from social media. Maybe it's not being so tight-fisted with our finances or our time. Maybe it's serving a little more often. That we would make our treasure the thing that we give to God open-handedly. But more so, I think about the moment in time that Jesus said yes to the Father. The moment in time when God didn't just risk losing his son like Abraham did, but he actually gave him away as a willing sacrifice. Go with me to Matthew 26, 38 through 39. Jesus he's about to go to the Garden of Gethsemane. His arrest is happening very soon. And this will lead into the weekend of his death. He says, then he said to them, the disciples, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. Going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will. You see, Jesus wrestled with the Father's will, but he didn't reject it. And in his yes, he provided a sacrifice that far outnumbered, far outweighed, and covered the sin of the world. His way was better. And through a yes, he brought heaven to earth. God says to Abraham, You have not withheld your son from me, and he provides a ram in the bush. And yet, God doesn't withhold his very own son from us. The ram in the bush is symbolic of Christ's sacrifice. This wrecks me because God didn't covet his own son, yet he covered Abraham's. He didn't covet his own son, yet he covers your family. He didn't covet his own son, yet he covers your finances. Yet he covers the groceries in your refrigerator. But he wasn't tight-fisted with his own. Is that not a God worthy of our trust? Is that not a God we can approach every border for, regardless of how we see it all mapped out? My husband has this Irish proverb. He says, "May the ground meet you where you walk." And I started to think about that as I wrestled with this concept of a trust fall. To walk or to fall where you see no boundary is terrifying. Absolutely. I don't know how people do tight ropes and get high up in the air. I could never. But the Lord wants to remind us that when we keep our eyes on the God above us, we don't have time to fret about the ground beneath us. Yeah, it might be scary to walk where we see no pavement. But God is asking us not to take our eyes off of him. Like Peter in the water, Jesus is saying, keep your eyes on me. Keep your eyes on me. You can confront that bondage. You can start that business. You can do that Bible reading plan with your kids. Keep your eyes on me. You see, God is placing the steps, and our role isn't to wait until we see them or to watch as he places them. Our role is not to micromanage God, but to walk out when he calls us to. You might be thinking of some steps you need to take. Maybe there's some dreams that God has placed onto your heart, or some decisions that need to be made as you trust fall into him. What's your yes today? Maybe it is concrete, like actually starting that business or leaning into community. Maybe it's getting healthy, letting go of unforgiveness or bitterness in your heart, reconciling a relationship. Maybe it's for the first time open-handedly giving or serving or joining a community group. Whatever it is, begin to ask in your life in what area you can disallow distrust. But before we go, I just want to bring it back to the basics for a moment. You see, our dreams are tools that God uses to bring kingdom. Our dreams are beautiful and they're orchestrated by God. The plans that he has for us, no man could fathom. But also, let's be reminded to show gratitude for the ultimate plan of them all. That the word became flesh and dwelt among us. That Jesus lived the life we couldn't live and died the death we couldn't die. And through the remission of our sins, we have eternal life with him. This isn't just about being a good person or having a good life. This is about the fact that Jesus came and covered every sin. Let's say yes to God's plans for us, but with the perspective that we're victors through what Jesus did. And hey, maybe that's not you today. Maybe you haven't said yes to Jesus or you haven't had that moment with him yet. I want to invite you into that. I want to invite you to know the God of heaven and earth who moved heaven onto earth when he decided to live a life, a blameless life for you and me. And when we look at Jesus from that perspective, we have an even if unshakable kind of faith. That means even when we get frustrated or when things don't make sense or when we have grief or loss or it's just not adding up, the math is not mathing. We know that what God did, what God accomplished through his son on the cross is absolutely enough. It's enough. If I never get a yes again, if every dream I've ever had doesn't come to fruition, the fact that I get to spend an eternity with Jesus, it's got to be enough for us. That's got to be the thing that propels us and compels us. And we got to share this with people. We can't be those people who lean on our own pride as a crutch because it stifles us. People need to know the love of Jesus. So I'm going to pray.